Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan, and that's
And
Brian.
I'm
Say hi,
Brian.
Brian. Say hi, Brian.
Hi, Brian.
Let's start over. Sorry.
Oh, there's another voice. We're all over the place here. So that's Brian. I'm Ryan. Yeah, that's all right. We're going on. This is the Bible Bistro podcast, all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to Christian faith. How are you doing, Brian?
I'm doing well and super excited. We got a special guest in the bistro with us today.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So this is Dr. Jason Staples, who's with us today, and I'll introduce you briefly, Jason. And we're real excited to have you. Thanks so much for coming and spending some time with us. Jason is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at NC State University. And he teaches courses there in biblical literature, early Judaism, Christian origins, ethics, globalism, conflict and violence, and various theoretical perspectives in the study of religion and society. Is that all? Do you don't have anything else you teach? Is that pretty much cover it?
That's not everything, but it
that's the majority. Yeah,
it's the majority. I've taught 23 different classes at this point.
Oh, wow.
23 separate classes. So
and
I've stayed busy.
Yeah, I bet. I pulled this right off of your Substack, and I'll say more about it later. It's an excellent Substack. We're going to recommend our listeners spend some time there. Also interested, you were just talking about this a little bit earlier. You've spent almost 2 decades in sports media, and you're a voice actor. So you're currently doing you said an audiobook version of your own book. Is that correct?
Yes, I am, and it's interesting because Cambridge actually just came to me saying, "Hey, do you want to do the audiobook or do you want us to, get the audiobook done?" I was like, "Well,
right.
Technically in the contract, I made sure that I have the rights to the audiobook." They're like, "Oh,
right.
Really? We didn't realize that." Yeah, I negotiated that. And then they've got a particular partner that normally does their audiobook production. I was like, well, I'll be happy to work with them for distribution and everything. And, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm as the author, I'll be able to voice it better than any other voice talent.
Right.
And as someone who's done audiobooks before, I'll be able to do this.
That's
and then
cool.
the company got back to me and said, or they got back to Cambridge and said, "Oh yeah, we love the samples of the stuff that he's given us, and we'd ordinarily would love to use his work on this, but we have a new policy that we won't do read by the author except for memoirs or whatever else. So if he's willing to have someone else read it and scrap all of whatever work he has in on it, then we'll do it." It's like, why in the world would I agree as someone who does, like, that's something I do to make money on the side. I read audiobooks.
Yeah.
And then I'm the author of it. Why in the world would I want someone else to read this?
I could see it'd be different if it was somebody who didn't know what they were doing. For example, never listen to an audiobook read by Stephen King, for example. There are people who just cannot do it and should not do it, but you do it on the side. So anyway, we're here to talk about your books. I was going to mention these two. This is The Idea of Israel, but then the book we're really wanting to talk about today, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, a fantastic book. And I have to make a confession here up front, Jason. Ryan heard you on Script podcast talking about this book, and he said, "Hey, this is really interesting stuff. I was really excited to hear it." He kind of laid out what you talked about there, and I'm like, I don't know. I'm a little dubious.
And that's true. That's exactly what it was like. Well, there's been a lot of thought put in this in the past. I'm like, listen, just listen to it.
But I have to repent now because Ryan went ahead and got your book, and he's excited about it and everything. I took this class with Matt Bates earlier this year, and this is one of the required texts. And I'm saying, hey, I'm going to have to read this book anyway. We read it together, and here's my repentance, and here's my apology to you. I am now telling people this is the best book that I've read in a long time. And in fact, for people who know me, I'm saying this is the best book that I've read since New Testament of the People of God by N.T. Wright. And if you know me, that was a foundational book for everything that I've done since then. So thanks so much for this book. Excited to hear you say a little bit about it. So what I thought I'd like to do first, Jason, if you don't mind, is if you just kind of lay out the basic thesis, just what are in Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, what's your basic thesis here in this book?
So the basic idea that I'm going for here is there's it's widely been sort of presumed or concluded within a lot of biblical studies and a lot of Pauline studies that uh, Paul's Gentile mission and his sort of views of Israel are hard to square, that they're at odds. Uh, and the basic idea that I've got in this book is that Paul's not inconsistent in these things. This is actually the inconsistency is a result of us not actually understanding the terms the way that he uses them, and really understanding the essence of his gospel well. And the basic idea is that Paul's mission to bring non-Jews into the body of Christ as equal members with Jewish members of the body of Christ, that this is not based on some sort of universalism or some move away from traditional Jewish theology or eschatological hopes, end time hopes, but is instead actually a direct and very logical trajectory, a result straight out of his expectations for Israel's restoration. And the sort of foundation piece for that is that Paul understands Israel as something bigger than just Jews. And that historically speaking, Paul reads his Bible and he sees a 12-tribe people of Israel. He understands that the bulk of that 12-tribe people ultimately rebelled against God, that we see various prophetic proclamations against those people, and a large portion of the people of Israel get scattered among the nations. And Paul concludes that essentially that portion of Israel became assimilated among the various nations, and in an ethnic sense ceased to be ethnically separate from the nations. Now, all things being equal, that would seem to be the end for that portion of Israel. But Paul believes in a God whose faithfulness extends beyond the grave, and that is both individually and corporately. And he actually believes that God is restoring the people of Israel from the nations in which they were assimilated by giving them the Spirit, which is happening through the proclamation of the gospel and so on. And then there's all sorts of downstream implications that come from that. But that's the sort of distinctive, I would say, of the book. But then there's all sorts of other things. I mean, if I were, telling the thesis from another angle, I would say that Paul's gospel is essentially the good news that God has given to Israel, and through Israel to the whole world, the opportunity to have the capacity to love God and live. And that, the Spirit is sent in order to give the capacity to love. So that would be another aspect. But in some sense, there's more than one individual thesis. But the first part, in terms of the relationship of Paul's gospel to the promises made to Israel, is really sort of the bedrock of the book.
Yeah. And I'll say the downstream stuff you talked about, that's one of the things that I really appreciate about this book. Your mind just, as you're reading it and you're grasping your thesis and you're seeing how great your argument is, you begin to see all kinds of other places where this applies. And then, to my chagrin, some of them you go ahead and later in the book and you deal with yourself. I'm thinking, oh, here's something I could really grab hold of, and you take care of it quite handily later on. But just great stuff. And let me go ahead and since I'm giving you this all this praise, you handle one of the things I've said about this when I was telling other people about it is you handle the Greek exegesis, the Hebrew exegesis, the Septuagint. You handle all of those much better than many many people are able to. And I in the preface of your first book, that idea of the siloization of our discipline, I can really tell you've worked hard to work out of that, and I really appreciate that. Do you want to talk about? Can you give us some idea of what was your original insight? Because you came to this pretty early in your career, not in your master's degree, not in your doctorate, but pretty early you came to this insight.
Yeah, it goes back actually to 2003 when I was in an undergrad class on the Hebrew Bible prophets. So the basic idea that there was a for that class, we had to choose a specific prophet to focus on. And then we had to write a term paper on something related to that prophet and prophetic book. And I chose Jeremiah. I thought that would be maybe the most interesting one. And one of the textbooks that we used for that class, for that one of the survey books, we used Abraham Heschel's The Prophets, which has been extremely influential for me. And I think it's one of the best books written in the 20th century. And a book that I would recommend anyone read. Anyone and everyone should read that book. It's a brilliant book. But one of the other ones that we read was by Gordon McConville. It's the IVP Exploring the Old Testament, Volume 3, I think, Prophets book. And it's just a quick survey book looking through the prophets with a little bit of very rudimentary commentary, but mostly just introductory material to each prophet, along with some other material historically and otherwise to situate. And I think it's an excellently done book on the prophets and providing that background. I actually think McConville is one of the most underrated, underappreciated scholars of his generation. I think he's done some really excellent work that has often been overlooked. He's undercited, but anyway, in that survey volume, one of the things that McConville pointed out that just stuck with me was that when you're reading Jeremiah, for example, and you're reading Jeremiah 3, Jeremiah suddenly turns and prophesies to the north and says, "Return, northern Israel, because southern Judah has made you look good by comparison." And then you get to the book of consolation, so Jeremiah 29 to 30 through 31. And Jeremiah is prophesying the reunion and restoration of both houses of Israel, northern kingdom, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. You get to the new covenant promise, and I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And McConville just sort of points out, just offhandedly, and one of the interesting things about this is that by the time Jeremiah is prophesying, and certainly by the time the book of Jeremiah is being edited, the northern kingdom of Israel hasn't existed for a really long time. I mean, you're talking about almost 150 years between Jeremiah, the prophet, and the north. And Jeremiah is fully aware of this. He talks about them having been given a writ of divorce and sent off. Right. He knows Hosea and uses Hosea. And Hosea is already talking about that. So, he says, it's an awfully big thing for Jeremiah to say, and exactly what Jeremiah has in mind is sort of, it's unclear exactly how he envisions this happening. So that's one thing he says. And then another place, and this actually stood out even earlier because it's earlier in the book, is when he was covering 2nd Isaiah. So the chapters of Isaiah that are really dealing with the after effects of the Babylonian exile. He points out that Isaiah is referring to and promising and celebrating the return of all Israel in these chapters with expansive language that is sort of surprising given that what we know about history. And he's not promising the return of Judah, he says, but he's talking about Israel. And he says, by the time of 2nd Isaiah, what then is Israel? And I thought that was such a really important and interesting point. And he just raises these questions in that volume and then just sort of lets them drop. And he's like, well, we don't really have a good answers for this.
Right.
And one of the things that stood out to me as I was starting to work on my Jeremiah paper was, as I was reading the book of consolation, obviously I was very familiar with the New Covenant promise, which is the longest Old Testament passage directly quoted anywhere in the New Testament. It's quoted verbatim from the Greek version in Hebrews, whole cloth.
Right.
It's the longest, single block of text quoted. So, it's very familiar. And then I was reading it, and it occurred to me, that's strange. The New Covenant doesn't say anything directly about Gentiles. And then when you get to the New Testament, they're all reading this as though this applies to Gentiles somehow. And I'm going, what exactly are they doing? Because when I read this,
right,
and I've just been spending a whole semester looking at historical context, Jeremiah is prophesying about a specific people. The house of Israel is the northern people, and the house of Judah is the southern people. And what I don't see are the people that in the New Testament seem to be getting the most connection with this. So squaring that circle wound up being like, that's where that started. And it wasn't, and it was sort of by the end of that class, I came to the conclusion that, well, if we read this way, if we read Hosea really critically, and we read what they're saying, couldn't this just be talking about assimilation, not my people, and then my people again from the not my people, and like this is assimilation and then like de-assimilation in some sense? Maybe that's what the New Testament people are doing. So I came to that. And, my 2003 paper already has that as a suggested trajectory of, this is what I think the New Testament is doing with this. It wasn't really until 2006, though, when I was in my master's and I had to do a paper on Romans 9 to 11. And during that time, I was actually reading the Bible together with a girl I was dating at the time. And we happened to be going through Genesis, and I happened to stumble across Genesis 48:19 as I was reading it aloud, and realized this says fullness of the nations in Hebrew. This doesn't just say like a multitude of nations or a cacophony of nations or, how a variety of different ways that it's translated into English generally. This is Maloha Goyim. Like, I know that word. I know that wording because I've been trying to puzzle through that all semester for this paper on Romans 9 to 11. Right. Oh my goodness. Oh. And once that was in place, it was, those 3 years between there, all of that snapped into place. And then from that point forward is like, I really need to do this because I don't think, and I think there's a real lacuna in scholarship here. So that's really where that all sort of started from. And it was a, pretty significant period. Actually, that was probably 2000. Now, I guess that was 2005. So it was 2003 and 2005 because I presented on it the next year in 2006. So that would have been in 2005. It was 2003 and 2005, that 2-year period, basically, where, a lot of the work was done for that.
For our listeners, mention the fullness of the nations in Romans, where we see that, where you see that.
That's Romans 11:25. Yeah, that's Romans 11:25, where, sort of on the fly, what Paul says is, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, lest you be wise in your own eyes, that a part of Israel or Israel has experienced a partial hardening. You could translate it either way there. But a part of Israel has been hardened for a while until the fullness of the nations comes in. And so in this way, all Israel will be saved. And that's such a strange phrase in Romans 11:25. And there's reams. I mean, there's just volumes of scholarship trying to piece together what Paul means by the fullness of the nations. And I mean, I'm talking about going back into the church fathers. They're debating this because it's such a weird thing to say. And this is how all Israel will be saved. Like, how are those two things connected? So those things really didn't compute. And then all of a sudden, when you realize fullness of the nations does appear one other place, and it happens to be the blessing of Ephraim, who's told that his seed will become the fullness of the nations.
Right.
And then you start to put that into play, and you realize that Paul's using a very, very distinctive phrase here to mark out what he's claiming is happening through the gospel. And it all plugged together at that point. So, that really was the sort of the impetus of this and the beginning of it. And I thought, at that point, 2005, okay, give me another 5-6 years. I'll, nail this down, demonstrate this, and then move on with life. And it took me another 18 years after that to really get it there and cross the finish line and be able to demonstrate that. But I do think it was better for all of the extra work that got put in there. Which was not actually on Paul. I mean, most of the work that I did in graduate school was in early Judaism and in some Hebrew Bible and a bunch of early Christianity and other things. So I kind of did everything other than Paul, which I think actually ended up being beneficial for me.
It's very good, and I'll say one of the things that I find striking about your whole thesis is it fits very well with a kind of God that is big enough to be able to accomplish His purposes in this way, and even to see ahead of time what was going to be necessary in order to bring about it. It's a worshipful experience for me actually when I think about that thesis, and I appreciate that too.
Yeah, Paul's God is a
I had
very,
an
very big God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Um, the, um, the other question I was going to ask, Ryan, do you want to jump in with anything before I
Yeah.
capitalize on this?
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that I listened to the OnScript podcast, I don't know if you could talk about this for a little bit, was the imagery of the potter there in Romans 9 there that talk about, or Romans 10 maybe. The imagery of the potter and some of that language, the Masoretic text and so forth, and getting a better handle on what Paul was saying about vessels of wrath and should show his mercy. Could you talk a little about that? That was the thing that really kind of piqued my ears when I was listening to this on that other podcast.
Yeah, and that is in Romans 9. It's 9:20 to 23. That passage where he goes into the potter and the clay image. Actually, in response to the question in Romans 9:19, for why does he still find fault, for who has resisted his will? And that's such an important question at this point in the argument. And then Paul's response is not to answer that directly, but to answer it with a metaphor, with an analogy. And the analogy that he gives is a potter working with clay. And, of course, that's a very pregnant biblical image that's used all over within biblical literature. I mean, you can take that all the way back to page 1 or page 2 of the Bible when, God in Genesis 2 goes right down and he creates human beings from, he creates Adam, he creates the human from the clay, from the dust of the earth. Mm-hmm. Like that is pottery imagery. Even there you could make a case, and I think it really is. It's like he makes living pottery, jars of clay, this idea that Paul uses elsewhere, that we are clay vessels. That's very important imagery, but that's what Paul does, is he uses that as the illustration. And this is immediately following the part of Romans 9, where what Paul does is he's trying to demonstrate that, look, God has not been unfaithful in how he's dealt with his people. The fact that what we're seeing now and the way that God is handling his people Israel now is not a reflection of God's infidelity, but rather this is God's utter and total fidelity beyond reason and beyond beyond what would be just. This is extending well beyond justice into mercy. Well, part of what he does there is he demonstrates that God chooses at each step of the way. He chooses Abraham, he chooses Isaac, he chooses Jacob, and in each case, the choice of one means not choosing others. Right? So then the question, of course, comes in, and then he says, of course, he raised up Pharaoh to specifically show his own power against Pharaoh. So then the question comes up. This is the natural question that immediately comes up in any sort of discussion of God's agency versus human agency and free will and determinism and all of these things of, well, if God so determined these things, then like, how can he blame us for anything? Why does he still find fault with us for sinning? Because who has resisted his will? And it's important, by the way, that that's in the perfect. Paul does not use the traditional wording of wisdom, the wisdom of Solomon, and also of Job, who ask the more proverbial question in the aorist, who resists his will? Right? But rather he asks it in the perfect, an empirical question. Who has resisted the will of God? I mean, come on, really? Well, when we get to the potter clay thing, he answers that question with this metaphor. And what my argument is that this metaphor has very much, especially in the modern world, been very badly read simply because people just don't have much experience working with clay anymore. So, you know, the way that this typically gets read, especially in Reformed type circles, is that Paul raises this question: why does he still find fault for who has resisted his will? And then Paul says, see, God's like a potter, and the potter gets to choose what he wants to make the clay into. And if God wants to make the clay into various vessels to just so that he can smash them to show how powerful he is, that's God's prerogative. So how dare you even ask that question?
Right.
But that's not what he's actually doing here. And there's, first of all, the matter of translation, and then there's the matter of the imagery, and those two things are connected. And the first thing that we have to do is, when we look at the imagery of the potter and the clay, we need to go back to where we see that imagery used most clearly within the biblical material that Paul is pulling from, and that's in Jeremiah 18.
Yeah.
And in Jeremiah 18, God tells Jeremiah to go out to the potter's field, go out and watch the potter, and I'm going to give you a message. And Jeremiah goes and watches the master potter at work, and then while the potter's working, the clay becomes misshapen in his hand, and so he balls it up and makes it into something else as he saw fit. And that's when God said, am I not like that potter? Can I not also do the same thing and change my mind depending on how you respond to what word I give? Oh, so the clearest place that we have a discussion of the potter and clay in the Bible, God uses that imagery directly with the prophet to emphasize not unilateral choice, but rather a dynamic process of working with something that doesn't always cooperate.
Right.
Okay, so we can put that in our, sort of under our hat as we look into this. And that's where the other thing is, when I was starting to read through this in Greek more carefully, and this was during the process of working on the dissertation in particular, I realized that the words that were there in Greek, and especially the grammar that's there, and this is a very difficult passage grammatically. It's elliptical. It doesn't have all of the parts of speech that you would expect for a full sentence, but the words that are there are not exactly what are translated. There's a whole lot of interpretation happening in each of the translations of this. And the thing that stood out to me is, first of all, the word makrothumia, or long-suffering or patience, is involved. And that ends up sort of taking over the way that people translate a couple of the other words that wind up being really important. And one of them is especially important, and that is the notion of heniken. This is the past tense, essentially, of the verb pharaoh, or to carry, usually, but it can be to carry or to produce. Now, to carry also is often translated with another word for carry, which is to bear. And so someone who bears children is someone who carries and produces a child. So bear actually works in English for this, except the way that it ends up sort of working in the history of interpretation in English is it takes on the other meaning of bear, which is, I can't bear it, right? As in to put up with, right? So the way that this ends up being translated in most modern translations is, what if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has borne, like as endured in some sense, and oftentimes in more modern translations, it's taken as endured, with much patience, the objects of wrath that are made for destruction or prepared for destruction, is like the ESV says, or the NIV. They both say that. So there are a couple things here. Number one, what exactly does it mean to bear with much patience, to bear a vessel with much patience? Right? Like what does it mean if I take this cup and I say, I'm being very patient in bearing with this cup?
Right.
That doesn't make any sense. It's a nonsense statement.
Especially with the image of the potter. Yeah.
Right. But if we do take a look at how Pharaoh is used especially in the context of things like pottery and other things, that word for to generate or to produce actually works, and it also happens to work for the carrying of something. And actually, there's a passage in Jeremiah where God actually carries out his vessels of wrath that are designated for the destruction of God's enemies. So they're instruments of God's destruction, not of their own destruction, but God carries them out. And it's the same word, just with an additional prefix. So that's something to note. The other thing to note is that the other key word here that comes back in is that we're not just talking about carrying versus, enduring, which I think enduring is just wrong. The other one is this. It doesn't say prepared for destruction. It has this word katertizda or katertizo. And that's the word that's used for fixing things or repairing things or emending things. This is what when the disciples are mending their nets after going out and fishing, they're fixing their nets. When Paul says to repair relationships, to do these sorts of things, that's the word that he uses. In the Septuagint, you have this used for restoring or repairing the wall of Jerusalem, these sorts of things. And you realize, wait a second, this is not about predestining these vessels for destruction, as though I just can't put up with these clay pots anymore, and now I'm going to smash them because I was planning all along to smash them. No. The language here has to do with the production process through the process of emendation and fixing something that has a tendency to go wrong. And so now, once we take that language and we put it together with the imagery that we get from the Hebrew Bible, we realize that what Paul's doing is he's actually not saying, why does God find fault for who has resisted his will? How dare you ask that question, because God is God can do whatever he wants, and you just have to grin and bear it. His response is, God is responsive to this. God's justice is such that he's not operating in a vacuum here. In fact, who has resisted his will has a very obvious biblical answer.
Right.
Us.
Right. Yeah.
All of us. From the very first pages of the Bible on, all we see is people resisting the will of God, and God patiently, with long suffering, as he says, what if God with much patience produces or brings about or bears vessels, even the vessels of wrath, the vessels that he has designated for wrathful purposes. That's the idea that we have here. So this is not about God choosing some people to burn in hell for all eternity for his glory. Most people maybe, but rather this is about how God interactively works with the lump of clay in a way that his mercy is to continue the shaping process, even though the clay has a tendency to go wrong. And so he keeps shaping and reshaping and amending and fixing and so on. And the opposite of that is hardening. When he takes his hands off and says, okay, this is what it's going to be, fine, your will be done, that's hardening. And that's the actual point of judgment, when potentially condemnation, is when God no longer wrestles with the clay to reshape it into something else. And once it's hardened, it is what it's going to be. So that's the idea that he's getting across here. And I think it really brings that whole image to life in ways that doesn't work if you treat clay in another fashion. And the other thing that I did in that article, and also a little bit in the book, is talk about, if you talk to any potter, anyone who's ever dealt with clay on a wheel, every single one of them talks about clay has a mind of its own. You have to learn to improvise. You may have an idea in mind, but you have to work on the fly, because it's going to push back on you, and it's going to kind of have its way in the relationship. And they all talk about it relationally in this way, to a fault. And we've lost that because a bunch of biblical scholars, people like me, we sit at desks and we don't deal with anything with our hands anymore. We don't deal with clay.
When
Yeah.
I wrote my review of your book, the point I made is that you make a really good case for, instead of a pottery class in undergrad being a kind of an idiom for a superfluous class, it actually could be a useful thing for a theological student. So,
The idea that getting our hands dirty and touching
yeah,
real world stuff might actually have
yeah,
something to teach us shouldn't be very surprising. And actually,
right,
this is one of the things I'm trying to convince my
yeah,
undergrads of these days is,
yeah,
guys, go outside and touch grass, go and make real stuff, like get a hammer
right,
out, do something else. Because if all we do is live in the digital world and live as
yeah,
disembodied intellects, we're going to miss the way that this world is actually put together
right,
and miss the real elegance of creation and how
right,
things work. And I think we also will be worse readers of
right,
texts if we're not
right.
actually living and acting and working in the world.
Well
Yeah.
said.
And,
Yeah.
and I appreciated that interpretation, because I read Heschel's Prophets many years ago, but it was just like you get this sense of the pathos of God, the passion of God working through the clay, as you mentioned him earlier. But I kept thinking that as you brought him
Yeah.
up, as just, I remember that from the prophets, is that's one of Heschel's main things, is the passion of God and working through his people. And reading that text, that Potter text in Romans, in the way that you presented it, really shows that and brings that forward. So I
Yeah.
really appreciated that from your book.
And one of the things that Heschel brings up is, why does God send prophets to Israel to begin with? Why do
Mm.
prophets exist?
Right.
And it's because God is crying out in pain to a people that is deaf and will not hear. So he raises up a prophet to feel his pain and express his pain and his work, and to speak on his behalf to a nation that is rebellious. In the absence of disobedience, you don't need prophets.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that Heschel gets across. And this kind of gets to, Moses' idea of like, would that all the Lord's people were prophets, right? The idea is that you need prophets. You need this speech of God to the people on God's behalf, because the people aren't listening, because the people aren't doing the will of God, because they are resisting his will. So God sends them prophets. That's the idea that Heschel, I think, absolutely hammers and nails down. And you get this idea of the prophet as just feeling the pain that God feels when God's people don't do his will. And
Right.
that, I think we a lot of Christian theologians and a lot of Christian readers of scripture have thoroughly and completely missed that aspect. I think that's something that, again, it's one of the real values of reading Heschel.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks. The one of the things, we keep saying all these things we appreciate about your book, and it's a fantastic book. The way that you, so many times you're saying, here's a place where scholars have said, well, I kind of throw my hands up. I don't know what Paul's saying here. I don't think he's making sense. I don't think he's being illogical. And you bring it and say, well, no, here's a way if we really understood this, we would say he's being completely biblical within his context. He's being completely logical. It makes complete sense. It's just, I think so many times they've thrown their hands up too quickly, and so I thought that was fantastic. We mentioned earlier that this thesis connects to so many other texts. And when I had a chance to ask you a question earlier, I asked about Matthew 10:5 and 6. I thought, oh, here's, how's he going to answer this? And you started in Matthew 1 or Matthew 2, I think, and went through the entire book of Matthew. And I'm like, well, clearly you haven't thought about this, and that is on your Substack, by the way. I found it back in October. You wrote through that because you said that was a question you got asked a lot. It's the whole thing when Jesus sends out the 12. Don't go to the nations or the Gentiles. Don't go to the Samaritans. Go to the house of Israel. And so I just wondered, and you answered it very, very well. Uh, I'm going to give you an option here. You want to kind of walk through that again because it was fantastic. But again, you can find that on your Substack, which both Ryan and I subscribe to, and I highly
Yes.
recommend. Or do you want to call an audible and just kind of do something else that shows how your thesis connects to another passage, something you'd be interested in talking about?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to do either one. I mean, the the main thing, and by the way, going back to the idea of, people throwing their hands up in the air and saying, well, Paul's just being contradictory or illogical or whatever.
Right.
My presumption as an interpreter has just generally been, and this is with any text that I'm reading, not just biblical material, has been that if I don't understand something, it's probably my fault as a reader. Right. That like, okay, this made sense to somebody as it was being written down.
Right.
And my presumption with biblical material is, okay, this made enough sense to a lot of people that they preserved it and handwrote it over and over again for thousands of years. So, I mean, something's going on here. If I'm not seeing how this makes sense, maybe it's my fault. What do I need to do to figure out what I'm lacking to be able to get the context necessary for this to make sense for me? Now, that doesn't mean that everything necessarily makes sense. I mean, I've got some typos in each of my books and, different things that, sometimes there's just an error. But that's sort of my default. That's sort of my default as a, exactly. But that's sort of my default presumption as an interpreter is if I don't understand something, it's almost certainly my fault. I do feel like a lot of biblical scholarship tends to work in the other direction. That like, if this doesn't say what I think it should, and if this doesn't accord in the specific way that makes sense to me right here in my own context, something's wrong with the text. Like this, obviously the author was mistaken, or obviously the author is just, he didn't really, get this, or he's contradictory or whatever. And, that may be true, but I think it's a last resort. And I think we throw up our hands way too easily, too often.
It reminds me of Umberto Eco talking about we need to be equal to the text that we're reading. So for example, just to use the example used earlier, the dealing with the clay. To understand this within its cultural context requires us to understand something about making pots out of clay. And so it's that kind of an idea, I think.
Yeah, and if you have any experience with pottery, that is about the last thing in the world that you're going to do to give an illustration of someone unilaterally making something, that, without any resistance from the object. So yeah, that's the idea. I suppose I'll go ahead and do the Matthew 10 thing because it's probably the easiest one. But yeah, I mean, this whole question of don't go on the road of the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And, okay, well, if the lost sheep of the house of Israel are in some way to be identified with the nations eventually, and also with the Samaritans, I mean, that's the thing. Any reader of Matthew, when he says the lost sheep of the house of Israel, don't go to the Samaritans, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The Samaritans, like their distinctive claim was that they were people from the house of Israel. Now, maybe they're not lost sheep. Maybe they're still there. But that's an interesting thing already that a reader from the first century is going to notice. But my take on this is that any passage especially in a book like Matthew, where you have a distinct direction in the narrative, it's a narrative where there's stuff that happens that matters for the stuff that comes after it. And the stuff that comes after depends on the stuff that came before. You have to read these things in the context of the book itself. Mm-hmm. And if you just choose that one verse out of context and outside that narrative, you're going to misunderstand it. Right. So the basic idea here is, I do think that throughout Matthew, the house of Israel is a straightforward way of representing the northern kingdom as opposed to the southern kingdom. And occasionally he uses that as to refer to the full 12 tribe entity. But the biggest thing is that we already have all the way, again, you mentioned when I did this before, I went back to Matthew 2. This goes all the way back to Matthew 2:6. At the very beginning of Matthew, you have the quotation of Micah 5:2. You, Bethlehem, of the land of Judah, are by no means least of the leaders of Judah, for from you will come a leader who will shepherd my people, Israel. So who's Jesus supposed to be? He's the one from Judah who is going to be the one appointed to rule over that restored Israel.
Israel.
So, and this goes even back further into Matthew's genealogy, right? Matthew's genealogy presents Jesus as the Davidic king that has not been restored since Jerusalem's destruction under Babylon. Well, if we're talking about the truly restored Davidic king, we're going back to biblical prophecies in Ezekiel and elsewhere, where the real restoration that involves the real newly appointed Davidic king, we're not just talking about Judah, we're talking about Judah and Israel, right? That's the way that this works. So how are we going to do that? Well, from that point forward in Matthew 2, we see, and this is, I think, borrowed from Mark. I think Matthew is using Mark, but Jesus' ministry involves him, first of all, in the northern part of the land, in the traditional areas that are associated with a number of those northern tribes. But what does he do in those passages? He's marching through the land, reconquering it. This is a reconquest, but his conquest is not casting out the Romans. It's not a military conquest in the sense of taking up fleshly swords. Instead, he's casting out the lesser deities, these daimones, and the agents of Satan, and he overcomes Satan and these lesser deities in the process of retaking the land as in this whole thing. So this is basically again setting up this larger narrative in which Jesus is preparing the land for the restoration that he also promises to his disciples. You 12 will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Tribes of Israel. So at that point, if he's going to be looking for remnants of the former northern Israelites, you go to Samaria, you go to the places where he actually settles in Capernaum and these other areas, right? He sets up in Capernaum, which is in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, and that's Matthew 4:13. He ties that to the promises of Isaiah 9:1 and 2, which promises hope to the northern Israelites in Galilee of the nations, of the Gentiles. You have all of these things that are put together, and that's setting the stage for, this is all about Israel's restoration. This is all about the fulfillment of those promises. And he's begun this process of reclaiming the land. But then all of a sudden, right in the middle of the book, we have this kind of question of exactly what does this look like? What does this entail? And the two individuals who most impress Jesus right at that point in the narrative, and it's not an accident that they're the ones that do it, are the centurion in 8:10 and the Canaanite woman in 15:28. And the one, and you notice 15:28, the Canaanite woman is 4 verses right after Jesus has explained that he came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. 4 verses after that, she bests him in the challenge riposte situation, and he kind of goes, "Look at her." Right? And so she recognizes that even the dogs eat the crumbs left over from the children's food. That's immediately followed by the feeding of the 4,000 with the 7 loaves, resulting in leftovers sufficient to fill 7 baskets. So what do we do with all of these things put together? Well, this is where Matthew ends up taking us all the way to the end. By the end of the book, we wind up with the Great Commission. And the disciples in chapter 10 are told, don't go to the way of the nations, don't enter any town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And you're not going to finish going through the cities of Israel until the kingdom before the kingdom comes. Well, that's not the last word, is it? What does Jesus do at the end? He sends them to make disciples of all nations. All nations. Well, why? Yeah. Because by the end of the book, it becomes clear that essentially the regathering of the lost sheep of the house of Israel is going to require and come together with the discipling of all the nations. But that only can happen once the resurrection happens and Jesus has full authority. He has all authority in heaven and earth. So the whole process is is dependent on this sort of narrative progression and this recognition of exactly where the lost sheep of the house of Israel actually are. Who actually does that refer to? And how does that actually work in practice? And then there's the other piece of this, and I dealt with this on the Substack. The other piece of this is the land itself. He sort of reconquers the land.
Right.
But you have the other side of that, where the word for land is also the same word for earth. So is he the one who inherits, are the meek the ones who inherit the land, as in like the narrow area of the promised land proper from the Jordan to the sea? Or is this the whole world? Right. And I think Esau, Macaulay, and others have demonstrated well that the way that this works in early Jewish interpretation and then in early Christian interpretation in Matthew and elsewhere is that the land promise ends up being read as a promise ultimately not only of that land, but of all the land, of the whole world. Right. And so the reason that they will not finish going through the cities of Israel before the kingdom comes is that Israel is scattered through the whole, not just through the whole land, but through the whole world. And so in order to get to Israel by the time of the end of the book has trained us, has retrained the way that we are to think about all of this, so that by the time we get to Matthew 28, we're thinking along these lines. You had to go through Matthew 10 to get there, but Matthew 10 is not where Matthew stops. And I think that's the key to understanding this.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that land earth thing in, because that was to me one of the two things that I found very convincing. The other one you didn't mention is, and I just want to bring it briefly, in chapter 2, after Herod dies and the message goes down for Joseph to bring his family back, the phrase is back, and they went to the land of Israel. And, again, it's one of those things. This is what I think your book has helped me do, is I don't just read Israel anymore and just think, oh, Israel, right?
Oh, yeah, obviously Israel.
Because we conflate that. We conflate that so often. But I think you asked the question, what was Israel then? What would have been called Israel then? And, where does he, and of course they go back to Nazareth is where they go back to the northern, back to Galilee. And to me, that was a real eye-opening, mind-blowing kind of moment. So I appreciate that.
There was no region of Israel in the in the Roman Empire.
Right.
There's obviously an understanding that this is the historical land of Israel for Jews. Jews and Samaritans are going, this is the land of Israel, but you had the province of Judea, and they, when they're told to go back to the land of Israel, that does matter. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that was to me, that was an eye-opening thing. I appreciated that.
Well, and I was going to say, well, I was just going to say, as Brian and I talked about this, and it seems silly now, but we can talk about Israel in the Old Testament, like, well, it's for all 12 tribes, and it becomes the northern tribes, and then you get to the New Testament, you're like, it just means the Jews, it just means Judah. You know what I mean? Like how it's kind of for me, as Brian said, like I can't see Israel now, even though I would have been able to talk about Israel very distinctively in the Old Testament about the separation between the northern and southern tribes. But how your work has kind of helped kind of reframe that for us.
I was explaining this to a former student, explaining your thesis, and I said, so basically what he's saying is Israel's referring to the northern tribes. The way it is in the Old Testament. It's like, duh, it's almost so obvious when you see it, but you're the one who saw it and pointed it out. It's fantastic.
Yeah, if I have a gift, it's that as a scholar, it's that I'm very much an amateur and a child. So I'm the one that asks the obvious questions, right? It's like, well, why do we think that? I don't understand. There's a lot of things I don't understand. And so then I ask the question, and I think a lot of people, it's just very easy for us to just presume like, well, obviously we know that. And I'm just the person I never grew out of the the stage that my children are in, which is but why? And at a certain point, like you want to say, just stop it. But I never grew out of that. And that's my particular gift, as it were. It's an annoying one, but
no, I think it's good.
Going beyond, it's the figuring out that maybe the obvious isn't as obvious.
There's a curious part to it, but then there's a boldness to it too, because you're basically saying, yeah, I mean, everybody is saying this, even the best scholars we have available, doing this work today is saying this, but I'm going to question that. I'm going to second guess that. There's a certain boldness that comes along with that too. I think both of those things are necessary. The curiosity, but then the willingness to look beyond. Oh, here's the pat answer. Let me see if I can find something.
Yeah, else. I don't know if it's boldness or if it's just a sort of a. I was raised with a very strong distrust of authority and just sort of the appeal to authority.
Right.
That appeal to authority doesn't make someone right.
Right.
And the basic idea is that if somebody's right about something, you should be able to figure out why. They should be able to explain why.
Yeah.
And if somebody can't explain why satisfactorily, that may not mean they're wrong, but it may bring up some reason to look into it a little bit more.
Right. But, well, the explanatory power I mentioned of your thesis, that you look at other stuff and you say, well, it fits here too. That's a part of the strength of it, I think.
Yeah.
Anything else that you want to bring up? I'm going to kind of wrap us up. I have a couple more things I want to say, but anything else that you want to just do in terms of?
I'm at your disposal.
Well, we've mentioned your Substack a number of times. I would really encourage us. You did a really interesting thing lately. Actually had a colleague of mine several years ago that floated this thesis about the Whore of Babylon and the idea that it's not necessarily referring to Rome. I thought that was an interesting part of your Substack. But you mentioned at the beginning of that that you're not thinking about doing another scholarly monograph or journal articles, but you're going to do more popular level stuff. And I wanted maybe to hear you share a little bit more about that and your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not that I haven't thought about it. And I mean, I've got a whole backlog of articles, and at some of them I just need to, polish up and get submitted, and I will eventually. Right. But, I've had an article on the prodigal son story, basically written since 2006 that I've just had sitting there. Right. And I need to finish it, but now I need to update some of the bibliography and all of that, because, it's been, almost 20 years since I wrote it. But, right. So there's some stuff that I'll do, but yeah, I mean, the process of doing academic work is, it's more painstaking. You have to turn over every leaf, and, you're constantly covering your backside.
Right.
And engaging with the, broader scholarly dialogue in certain ways, and you're writing in ways that it's different, and all of that for a smaller audience, right? The number of people who are going to read this book is significantly smaller than if I had published a more popular level treatment with, say, a publisher that is not a university press. Now, right. The benefit of university press is, first of all, you're going through the peer review process in a bit of a different way. There's prestige and cachet that go with that. There's certain connections to library holdings and things like that, and a certain quality control, though not necessarily with the material product, as you both know. The pages of this book have fallen out on a lot of people, which has rankled me a good bit, because, I get emails from people. I'm like, I don't have anything to do with this. I don't print the thing. But
what do you think about what I wrote on them?
Right. Yeah. So, that, the incentives for it, and the incentives for this are, to continue to do a lot of academic work and all of that, tend to be things like, tenure promotion and advancement within the field and all of that. And I'm not in a position where any of that actually applies to me. I'm an adjunct professor where, I don't know whether I'm going to have a job year to year. And I have no research. It does not matter how much I publish or anything like that. It doesn't result in career advancement or promotion or, merit pay raises or anything like that for me. So the incentives for me to actually do that kind of publishing, which are going to be read by fewer people, it has limited benefit within the academy, and it takes longer and is harder in a lot of ways. For at least for me, for a lot of academics, the way that we learn to write is for that. And so for a lot of academics, it's harder to write for a popular audience because, you just learn to write otherwise. For me, it's not. For me, it's actually easier to write the other way, which makes me kind of strange within the field in that respect. But what that means is that all the incentives are kind of against me spending a lot more time. It took me 20 years to do these 2 books.
Right.
The incentives are against me spending another decade on another academic book when I can spend time writing more stuff that more people are going to be interested in reading. And frankly, some stuff that I'm more interested in writing. So, some of the stuff that I'm going to be doing is, I do want to do a trade book version of this book of Paul and the Resurrection of Israel.
That could be important. Yeah.
Which won't be, it's not going to be exactly, it's not just going to be and I don't want to say it this way, but it's not going to be a dumbed down version of this where it's just the same argument
abridgment
and abridged, but basically something that is sort of a second stanza that rhymes with this to give the basic paradigm and explain this for, a smart 6th grader, 7th grader could pick this up and have no problem with it, with a good bit less, intramural discussion, right? In reading this book, there's a lot of dialogue that's happening between me and lots of other people in the field historically. Right. I'm taking pot shots at Bultmann. I'm interacting with E.P. Sanders. I'm arguing with and borrowing from Paula Fredrickson and Matthew Thiessen and all sorts of other good scholars. But in a more popular version, instead of having an entire 2 sections of a chapter where I'm explaining why I don't believe that Thiessen got this particular thing right and that this is a better alternative. Instead, you just say, here's what I think. Right. And so for a lot of readers who are just not that interested in the back and forth of, okay, well, here's the translation that they're proposing. And here's the 12 reasons why, in terms of very careful breakdowns of the Greek grammar, this doesn't work.
Right.
You just say, this is the best way to read this. So that's more of the sorts of things that I'm going to be doing in the near future. I'm about to sign a contract for one thing that's geared towards sort of, interested lay people and also people in the pulpit kind of context, pulpit Bible study leaders and interested lay people, rather than this was first and foremost a scholarly book that I've tried to write in a way that would be accessible, if maybe a bit difficult for the interested lay person. The next one is going to be, so the one that I'm about to sign for, it won't be a trade book exactly, but it'll be directed first and foremost at the interested layperson and Bible study leader. And then maybe some scholars might have interested in it. It's flipping that. And then the same thing with the trade book version of this book and other things. That's the direction I'm going. And that's where I'll go.
Not only a wider audience, but probably have a more of an impact on what you care about as well. I would say probably
if we're being honest, the most impactful biblical scholarship in the world right now that's happening is probably the Bible Project.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean,
they're not.
behind this podcast, but yeah, I would agree.
This podcast is.
But I mean, there's
No,
a
you're
lot
right.
of cutting edge biblical
Yeah.
scholarship that's happening in the academy. But if we're
Right.
looking at what I think will probably have the most actual impact,
Right.
20 years from now, my guess, 30 years from now, my guess is that the number of people that the Bible Project will have impacted to read deeply and all of that will wind up having probably as big of an impact on the academy itself, because some of those people will go into academic biblical
Right.
studies, and then certainly on stuff outside. So, I do think we have to evaluate as scholars what are we trying to do, and who are the people we're trying to impact, and what is our audience, and all of that. And I'm at a point in my life and my career where career advancement is just, it's not that important to me, and it's not something that I as far as I can tell, I have any real chance at anyway. So I want to move into impacting the things I want to impact.
I think you're not the only one. I think that there are some other people who are kind of thinking in that same strain, and I applaud it. I think it's great. I do want to mention this C.S. Lewis book you're working on currently. I'm interested in that, and I haven't mentioned one of the fun things about reading Paul and the Resurrection of Israel is all your chapter titles that you use. Both well-known Lewis and Tolkien books, and also lesser-known Lewis and Tolkien books, and Dostoevsky and other literary figures. That was a fun kind of a subplot to the entire thing. But you're writing a book on C.S. Lewis or Lewis and Tolkien's use of scripture. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, I'm focusing on Lewis. I haven't expanded it to Tolkien. I might do something separate on Tolkien down the line. But but yeah, I'm doing a book on Lewis' use of scripture and how Lewis read scripture. Now, there's actually been another book that has just come out on this by Leslie Baines that is actually something I recommend people get. It's a very interesting piece of scholarship. Actually, it's right. Here's a pre-pub version of it.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
that's the book. But I didn't know that she was doing it, and it turned out she and I did a lot of the same things in terms of going back and looking at things like Lewis's marginalia in his theological books, and what he's taking notes on, and what he's underlining in his Bibles, and various notes that he's got in the margins of his Bibles and things like that, which she did. And then I've done, and what's funny is we had lunch last SBL, Society of Biblical Literature meeting out in San Diego, and it turned out that even though we did a lot of the same work, we're bringing such different angles and lenses at it that there's very little overlap, and so we were both thrilled. It was like, oh, this is great. We were both really pleased to I was excited about what she's doing and produced, and I think she's pretty excited about the direction I'm going with mine. But
good.
But yeah, I'm looking at how he, in certain places, like there's a talk I gave recently that is a draft of one of the chapters that I'm doing, that's looking at how Lewis reads the atonement, and particularly how he interprets the central chapters of Romans, and specifically then how that gets put together in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which ends up being a re-narrativization of the very concepts that he's working through and how he reads the Bible there. So that's one example. I'll be doing another chapter on Till We Have Faces, where I'm looking at his depiction of the concept of holiness in Till We Have Faces, and how that illustrates how he's reading that concept in the Bible, and then pulling from some of his other work to show that. So, there's a variety of different things that I'm doing with this, but yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. It was
cool.
It was the project that I decided I wanted to do right at the time that I was finishing this Paul book, where it was like, I've got to do something else. I've done this for 20 years, and I've had other projects that I've wanted to do too, but like I've got to do something that's in an area where I really enjoy a little bit more, because you get burnt out spending time doing really deep projects, diving deep into scholarship. And this is one where, I think Lewis was a really good reader and a really interesting reader. Even where I don't agree with him, I find that his readings are really rich and have a lot to contribute. So I want to bring those forward and sort of give a nod to my old master in some sense.
Cool. Sounds cool. Anything else you want to promote? Again, I'm going to mention your Substack. Is there anything else you got going on right now, or anything else you want to tell
Not
people
really.
about?
I'm hoping that I'm going to have lots more to go on in the near future. I mean, I will at some point be launching the thing that I've wanted to do for about 10 years, which is the Bible Pod, podcast and video stuff, which is going to take a little bit more preparation and time. But that it's one of the problems that I have, and this is why I took 20 years to do these 2 books, is I don't like doing things halfway or poorly.
Right.
And I could probably launch a version of the Bible Pod stuff tomorrow, and it probably would be fine, but it wouldn't be to the standard that I want just yet. And so I want to get a couple more things done. And in some sense, this has become but there's a lion in the street. I'll be torn apart. And my family keeps telling me, just launch the thing, just get up there and talk. But I've been hesitant to do some of that until I get a couple more ducks in a row. And then that'll be something else that, for those who come across this in another year or so, maybe that's up by then as well. But until then, no, everything else is there. I'm not hard to find.
Okay. Well, we appreciate you coming again, and we certainly are not. We're advocates of doing what you can when you can, and not waiting for perfection. we're living examples of that.
We've learned that before doing this.
It's just
sometimes you got to launch,
but it's so hard to do that, right? And again,
it is.
Sometimes
you're putting yourself out there.
Sometimes the benefit of taking that approach is, I do feel like the 2 books that I produced, because I spent as much time on them as I did, ended up being a lot better than they would have been had I done them in 5 years.
Right.
Hopefully they'll have more staying power. But the flip side of that is I do suspect that if I'd done them in 5 years, I might actually have a job. I might have a tenure track position or a tenured position, these sorts of things. So, that's always the tough balance, is sometimes you have to make you have to determine where you're willing to sacrifice precision and quality for, good enough. And done is better than perfect, but how close to perfect do we need to get before it's done?
Yeah. Well, I'll say, Ryan, it took him 3 years to get me on this podcast.
It did. And I want to say, you talk about the 10 years. I just want to say thank you for the time you did take on it, because for me, I know Brian's more well-read than I am. But for me, I mean, it was a really important book, and it's, I've already had conversations with others in my sphere and my circle about this, and how important it is to kind of reshape our thinking, and that it will bear fruit. Maybe not in tenured professorship at this point, but at least in my those that I know that are believers and having these conversations, like it is bearing fruit. And so I just want to say thank you, because it is excellent.
Well, thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll anything else you want to say, Ryan, before we sign off?
Well, I just, if you want to buy Jason's book, you can go to our website, thebiblebistro.com. We'll have a link for it right there on the homepage. You can go there and click. We'll have.
Don't complain to us if the pages fall out.
Don't complain to us if the pages fall out.
There is a link you can go to. You can contact Cambridge University Press through their customer service, and at least a few people I know of have gotten replacements, but I don't know exactly. Your mileage may vary.
There's an audio book coming of it too that you're working on. So
that's coming.
Yep. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I think that's it for us. You can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. We'll have links to Jason's all your Substack and books and all that stuff that are available there. And so we just want to say thank you so much for giving us the time and for writing your book and sharing some of your insights.
Yeah, thank you both so much.
Yeah. Take care.